The sound of cars and sirens filled the nights in New York, but for Tommy, those noises were just part of his routine. At only 12 years old, he knew more about survival than most people would learn in a lifetime. Dodging through the streets, he avoided trouble, focusing on finding food and shelter wherever he could. The alley behind a downtown bakery was one of his favorite spots, mostly because the employees sometimes left leftover bread and pastries near the trash. It wasn't a dignified life, but it was all he knew. Buddy, his loyal companion, a stray dog he found in the same miserable conditions, followed him closely. The dog was small and scruffy, but for Tommy, he was the only true friend he had. Buddy shared the hunger, the cold, and the fear with the boy, but he also gave Tommy something he hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to keep going. One night, as he walked along the sidewalk, Tommy looked up at the bright city lights and wondered what life was like inside those fancy apartments, where the heat never went out and there was always food on the table. Do people even realize how lucky they are? He thought. He could never understand how some had so much while others like him had absolutely nothing. But Tommy never allowed himself to sink into sadness. His mom, before she passed away, always told him that even when the world was unfair, honesty and good character were the only things of real value he would ever carry. And Tommy held on to that lesson like an anchor, a thin line separating him from other street kids who sometimes turned to petty crimes to survive. As he walked down a more deserted street, something in the corner of an abandoned building caught his eye. There was a briefcase lying on the ground open, with papers scattered around. His first reaction was curiosity. "What's a fancy briefcase like that doing here?" he muttered to himself. Buddy sniffed the object but didn't seem to care much. Tommy approached slowly, his heart racing. He knew he shouldn't get his hopes up, but something about that briefcase seemed like it could offer a way out. He quickly gathered the papers, stuffing them back into the case. When he noticed the names, signatures, and official seals, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. He didn't understand everything those documents meant, but he knew enough to realize they belonged to someone important. The name William Harris stood out on most of the papers. Tommy had heard of him, sometimes seeing his name on magazine covers in store windows. Harris wasn't just a rich man. He was someone with the kind of fortune that could change lives in the blink of an eye. Tommy glanced at Buddy, who was watching him with curious eyes. For a moment, Tommy let himself imagine. Maybe he could sell those documents. Maybe with the money, he and Buddy could finally get off the streets. Who knows? Maybe they could buy new clothes, maybe even rent a small warm room. He sat on the curb, holding the briefcase in his hands. The cold of the night seemed to grow sharper as he weighed his options. Buddy lay down beside him as if he too was waiting for a decision. Tommy knew a lot of people would do whatever it took to survive. He had sold small things before, but never anything like this. Something inside him, though, wouldn't let him go through with the idea. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, soft but firm. "No matter what happens, Tommy, always do the right thing." The memory felt like a knife in his heart. As desperate as he was, he couldn't betray what his mom had taught him. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. Tomorrow, somehow, he would find William Harris and return the briefcase. But that didn't make things any easier. Walking up to the door of such a powerful man, asking for nothing in return, was something few would have the courage to do. And what would he get out of it? Maybe nothing but the satisfaction of knowing he did the right thing. As he prepared to face this new journey, the distant sound of sirens reminded him that for now, his life was still on the streets. Tomorrow, maybe, things would change. But that night, he wrapped himself tighter in his old jacket with Buddy by his side and tried to dream of something better. The morning sun had barely risen when Tommy woke up. The cold was still intense, and his body, curled up under layers of newspapers and his worn-out jacket, struggled to keep what little warmth it had held onto through the night. Buddy, loyal as ever, licked his hand, a simple gesture that made Tommy smile. The dog was the only constant in his life, filled with uncertainties. Tommy glanced at the briefcase beside him and let out a deep sigh. The decision he had made the night before seemed even heavier in the daylight. Is it worth it? He wondered, as he tucked the briefcase under his arm and began to walk. His stomach growled with hunger, and he knew the walk to William Harris's building would be long, both physically and emotionally. New York's streets were starting to come alive with the morning rush. Cars, bikes, and hurried pedestrians passed by Tommy, most without even noticing him. But he observed everything like an outsider, on the margins of a world that seemed to exist in a bubble that didn't include him. He didn't belong to that world, but he walked through it, carrying the determination of someone who knew he was doing the right thing. As he approached the busier streets, where skyscrapers made of glass and steel reflected the rising sun, doubt began to creep in again. Tommy didn't know exactly where William Harris's building was, but he knew it was one of the tallest in the city. To him, Harris was almost a mythical figure, untouchable and cold, like the towering buildings he controlled. Why would someone like Harris care about a street kid returning his briefcase? Would he even believe me? Tommy thought. These thoughts followed him as he crossed through different neighborhoods. The smell of bakery started to fill the air, and Tommy, hungry, paused for a moment in front of a storefront. The aroma of fresh bread and pastries filled the air, and Buddy looked at him expectantly as if hoping for a miracle. "Not today, Buddy. Maybe later," Tommy muttered, ignoring the burning hunger in his stomach as he continued walking. After nearly 2 hours of walking, Tommy finally arrived at the block where Harris's building dominated the skyline. It was one of the largest in the city, with an imposing blue glass facade. The contrast between Tommy's life and this world of luxury and power had never been so obvious. He stopped on the sidewalk looking up, feeling small and insignificant. Even so, he clutched the briefcase to his chest, reminding himself why he had come this far. "I can do this," he whispered to himself. Carefully crossing the street, he approached the building's entrance. The doorman, dressed impeccably in a navy blue uniform, looked at him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Tommy, with his messy hair and dirty clothes, was certainly not the kind of person who usually passed through those doors. "Can I help you, kid?" the man asked, his voice filled with doubt. I need to speak to Mr. Harris," Tommy said, gripping the briefcase tightly in his hands. "I have something that belongs to him." The doorman frowned. "William Harris? And what would a kid like you have to do with Mr. Harris?" Tommy took a deep breath. He had expected this kind of reaction. People always saw him as a nobody, someone with no worth. But this time he had something important, something that set him apart. "I found this briefcase." He held it up for the doorman to see. "It has his documents in it, stuff he probably wants back." The man narrowed his eyes, studying the boy and the briefcase. Something about Tommy's tone, the way he spoke, made the doorman hesitate for a moment. Despite his appearance, the boy seemed sincere. "Wait here," the doorman said, before stepping into the lobby to make a call. Tommy stood there nervous. He wondered if this would really be worth it, if someone would actually come talk to him, or if he'd just be kicked out without a word. Time seemed to drag as he waited, feeling the curious and suspicious glances from a few people passing by. Minutes later, a woman in a suit came out from the lobby. She introduced herself as William Harris's assistant and looked Tommy up and down, clearly trying to figure out what was going on. "You said you have a briefcase that belongs to Mr. Harris?" she asked, sounding skeptical. "Yes," Tommy replied, holding the briefcase firmly. "I found it in the street and thought he might want it back." The assistant studied him for a moment, surprised by the boy's simple honesty. "Come with me," she finally said, motioning for him to follow her into the building. Tommy hesitated for a second, but then followed her. Buddy was stopped at the entrance, and Tommy had to tie the dog's makeshift leash to a post, his heart heavy at leaving him behind, even if only for a moment. "I'll be back soon, Buddy," he promised, a lump in his throat. As he stepped through the automatic glass doors, Tommy felt like he was crossing into another world. The elevator was made of glass, and as it climbed the floors, Tommy watched the city below get smaller and smaller. He had never been in a building this tall before. The cold shine of the metal and glass reflected his tired face, making him feel even more out of place. The contrast between his reality and the luxury surrounding him was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Emily, the assistant, stood beside him in silence, occasionally glancing at the briefcase as if trying to figure out why a street kid would be carrying something so important. When the elevator finally stopped at the top floor, the doors opened, revealing a large hallway decorated with modern, minimalist art. Every sophisticated detail around him only emphasized his humble condition. "Mr. Harris is waiting for you," Emily said, motioning for Tommy to follow her. He swallowed hard and walked behind her, his heart racing. The marble floor echoed every step, amplifying his anxiety. At the end of the hallway, a massive double door opened, revealing a luxurious office surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. In the center, behind an immaculate glass desk, sat. He was exactly how Tommy had imagined him. Tall, with perfectly combed grey hair and dressed in a custom-made suit, Harris exuded power and coldness like the very building he commanded. His piercing blue eyes fixed directly on Tommy, and the boy felt even smaller in the presence of such a commanding figure. "You're the kid with the briefcase, right?" Harris said bluntly, crossing his arms over his chest. Tommy nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he held the briefcase. He took a few hesitant steps forward and placed it on the glass desk. He felt tiny, standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the country. "I found this lying in an alley," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I knew I had to return it. It's yours, sir." For a moment, silence filled the room. Harris looked at the briefcase, then at Tommy, his expression unreadable. The tension was palpable, and Tommy wasn't sure what to expect. Part of him feared being accused of theft or being thrown out without so much as a "thank you." "And why did you return it?" Harris asked, leaning forward slightly. "Most people in your situation would have seen this as a chance to make some money. You have nothing, don't you?" "Don't." The question caught Tommy off guard, but he didn't hesitate in his response. "I just did what I thought was right." He lifted his eyes to meet Harris's gaze. "My mum always said that even when the world seems unfair, being honest is the only thing that matters." Harris stared at him for a few more seconds, as if trying to decipher the boy in front of him. Then, without a word, he opened the briefcase and flipped through the documents. Everything was there, contracts and deeds worth millions. Harris carefully closed the briefcase and leaned back in his leather chair. "Your mother must have been a good woman," Harris said, his eyes now softer, a thoughtful tone in his voice. Tommy nodded, swallowing the sadness that always surfaced when he thought of his mum. He was standing in one of the most luxurious offices in the city, in front of one of the richest men in the country, and all he had to offer was his honesty. He felt vulnerable, and the weight of his hunger and exhaustion seemed even more overwhelming. "I'm not asking for anything, sir," Tommy said, trying to keep his gaze steady. "I just thought you should get back what's yours." Harris observed him in silence for a few moments, his eyes studying the boy more closely. It was clear that Tommy wasn't expecting anything in return, and that intrigued him. Harris was used to people always wanting something in exchange for any act of kindness. But here was a boy with nothing, returning something of immense value, asking for nothing in return. Finally, Harris sighed and stood up from his chair. "Have you eaten today?" he asked unexpectedly. Tommy was surprised by the question and hesitated, shaking his head. His stomach growled with hunger, but he hadn't come here expecting to be fed. "Come on," Harris said, motioning for the boy to follow him. "Let's get something to eat." Tommy blinked, incredulous. The offer seemed surreal. He followed Harris through the hallways of the upper floor to an impressive dining room. The white marble table gleamed under soft lighting, and a staff of attendants served them promptly. Sitting at that luxurious table, with fine dishes and food he had never dreamed of tasting, Tommy could hardly believe what was happening. He looked at the plate in front of him, and then at Harris, who sat at the other end of the table, watching him closely. "Don't be shy. Eat," Harris said, starting to eat as well. Hungry, Tommy picked up his utensils and began to eat slowly. Every bite was an explosion of flavor, something completely different from anything he had ever tasted on the streets. The silence between them was unusual, but not uncomfortable. Harris seemed thoughtful, as if he was evaluating more than just the situation. After a few minutes of silence, Harris spoke again. "So, what are you going to do now?" he asked. Tommy paused for a moment, his fork suspended in the air. He didn't have a clear answer to that question. He would survive another day on the streets, maybe find something to eat later. But he didn't want to sound desperate or pitiful. "I guess I'll keep trying to do the right thing," he said, hesitating, choosing his words carefully. Harris placed his fork on the table and looked at him. The answer, so simple and direct, seemed to resonate with something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Maybe I can help you with that," Harris said, his voice now softer, but heavy with meaning. Tommy wasn't sure what that meant, but something inside him knew that in some way, his life was about to change. After the meal, Tommy felt dazed. It wasn't just the food, more than he'd eaten in days, but the strangeness of the entire situation. Sitting at a luxurious table next to a billionaire, he felt like a stranger in a world he clearly didn't belong to. And yet, something in Harris's gaze suggested that this world could somehow be about to change for him. When they finished eating, Harris led him back to the office. Silence once again filled the space, now heavy with expectation. Tommy, still unsure of what was coming next, sat timidly in the leather chair Harris pointed to. "You know, kid," Harris began, crossing his arms and leaning against the glass desk, "honesty is a rare virtue, especially in the world I live in." He paused, looking at Tommy with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "I deal with powerful, rich people, and most of them would do anything to get ahead, no matter who they had to step on." Tommy listened closely, though he wasn't sure why Harris was telling him all this. He was just a street kid. What could it possibly matter to someone so influential? "You could have sold those documents," Harris continued, his expression now more serious. "You could have traded them for some quick cash, but instead you came here, expecting nothing in return. That's something worth recognizing." Harris stood up from his chair and began pacing the office slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed to be reflecting on something deeper, something beyond just the return of the briefcase. "I had a tough childhood too," he said suddenly, his tone unexpectedly personal. "People see me now as a man who has it all, houses, cars, businesses. But what they don't know is that I was once where you are, with nothing. Nobody believed in me back then. I had to fight for every penny I have now." Tommy blinked, surprised. He never would have imagined that William Harris, a man who seemed born into wealth, had faced hardships. That small fragment of vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, and Tommy realized there was much more to this man than met the eye. "What are you going to do now, Tommy?" Harris asked suddenly, interrupting the boy's thoughts. "Keep living on the streets, waiting for another miracle to fall into your lap?" The question hit Tommy like a blade. He didn't have a clear answer. All he knew was survival, barely having time to think about the future. But before he could respond, Harris continued. "I want to offer you a chance," Harris said, sitting on the edge of the desk and looking directly into Tommy's eyes. "I'm not talking about charity, but an opportunity. If you really want to change your life, I'm willing to help. A place to live, food, and an education. But in return, I expect you to keep being the honest kid I met today. What do you say?" Tommy sat in silence, absorbing every word. Part of him wanted to accept immediately, but another part hesitated. The offer seemed too good to be true. Why would a man like Harris with so many resources care about him? And what if somehow he didn't live up to the expectations? But as he looked at Harris, Tommy saw something he hadn't expected. Sincerity. The billionaire didn't seem to be making an empty gesture. He was offering a real chance, something he in some way had also needed once. Tommy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision in his chest. He thought of Buddy, tied up outside, and how the two of them had survived together for so long. And he thought of his mother, of the words she always repeated. "Always do what's right, Tommy, even when it's hard." "I accept," he finally said, his voice firm, though slightly trembling. "I want to change my life. I want to do what's right." Harris nodded, satisfied with the response. He extended his hand to Tommy, sealing a deal that felt like more than just an act of help. It was the beginning of something bigger, a path Tommy had never imagined walking. "Good," Harris said. "From today you have a home." That night Tommy didn't return to the streets. Buddy was taken to a veterinary clinic where they would take care of him, and Tommy was brought to a room in Harris's house, a place that seemed straight out of a dream. The bed was large and soft, the covers made of fabric he had never touched before, and yet, when he lay down, it was hard to fall asleep. Harris kept his promise. He didn't just offer a roof over Tommy's head, but began planning his future. In the days that followed, Harris provided him with new clothes, arranged medical exams, and within weeks, Tommy was enrolled in a private school. It was as if his life had changed in the blink of an eye. But with comfort and security came challenges. School was completely different from what Tommy was used to. He had never attended formal classes, and now, surrounded by rich, privileged kids, he felt like a complete outsider. Even so, with every new obstacle, he remembered the commitment he had made, to take advantage of the opportunity and stay true to himself. As Tommy tried to adapt to his new reality, a sense of uncertainty grew within him. His life was now safer, but he knew there was something bigger at play, something he still had to discover. The first days at the new school were, without a doubt, the hardest of Tommy's life. He had imagined that leaving the streets and entering a safe environment would be the beginning of a better life, and in some ways, it was. But the reality he faced at the elite private school was something he wasn't prepared to handle. At first, it was the culture shock that hit him the hardest. The wide, well-lit hallways, the spotless uniforms, and the expensive backpacks hanging on the students' shoulders were a brutal contrast to the world of survival he had left behind. The teachers talked about subjects he barely knew, and the other students chatted with a confidence that felt so distant from his own reality. On the first morning, as he waited for his turn to be introduced to the class by the teacher, Tommy grew nervous. He could feel the curious and judgmental stares of the other students. They whispered to each other, and although he couldn't hear what they were saying, he was sure it wasn't anything good. "Is that the new kid?" a voice said behind him as he waited outside the classroom. Tommy turned around and saw two older boys, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Yeah, that's him, the street kid. I heard Mr. Harris picked him up off the sidewalk," the second boy said with a sneer, as if coming from such a low place was something to be mocked. Tommy felt his face flush, but he tried to keep his composure. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to come up with something that would make these boys understand he wasn't so different from them. But deep down, he knew that in some ways, he really was. "What are you guys staring at?" a girl's voice interrupted the boys. Tommy looked up to see a girl his age approaching. Her uniform was perfectly tailored, and she carried herself with an air of confidence that intimidated him. The two boys fell silent and walked away, apparently losing interest in continuing their taunts. "Don't mind them. They always have something to say about anyone who's different," she said bluntly. Tommy nodded, grateful, but unsure of how to respond. The girl's kindness was unexpected. "I'm Kate," she said, extending her hand. "And you're Tommy, right?" "Yeah." "That's me," Tommy said, shaking her hand timidly. He realized that she didn't seem to judge him the way the others did. There was something in her attitude that suggested she didn't care about the differences. "My dad works for Mr. Harris. I heard he gave you a chance. That's cool." Kate smiled, and Tommy felt like maybe she really did want to be his friend. "Yeah, he gave me a home," Tommy said, still unsure how to describe his new reality. Kate looked at him for a moment, considering his words. "Well, if you need any help around here, you can find me," she said, before turning to leave. "And don't worry about the others. They'll get used to it." Tommy waved in silence, not sure exactly what to think. But for the first time since he had arrived at that school, he felt that maybe he wasn't completely alone. The following days were a mix of progress and frustration. Harris had arranged for private tutors to help him catch up to the other students, and Tommy was determined to learn. But the feeling of being out of place persisted. He was still the street kid in the eyes of others, and he was slowly starting to notice the weight of their judgment. Math and science classes were tough, but he gave it his all to keep up. His mind, accustomed to thinking quickly and practically on the streets, struggled to adapt to the new pace of learning. At night, when he returned to Harris's house, he spent hours studying, feeling the physical and mental exhaustion pile up. Harris, for his part, watched him from a distance, always careful not to interfere too much, but making it clear that he expected great things from Tommy. There were moments when Tommy felt the pressure to meet those expectations, and that weighed heavily on his shoulders. Buddy, who now lived comfortably in the backyard, was his one constant source of relief. Every time Tommy came home, the dog greeted him enthusiastically, wagging his tail as if everything in the world was right. Sometimes Tommy sat in the yard with Buddy, quietly talking about his struggles at school, and the dog just sat by his side, silently listening. It was on one of those nights, as he stroked Buddy's fur, that Tommy realized how much his life had changed. He had a roof over his head, food, and for the first time in a long time, a chance at a future. But at the same time, he felt caught between two worlds. He still carried the scars of the streets, and the new world he belonged to didn't seem to fully accept him. "I just want to do the right thing, Buddy," he whispered to the dog, who looked at him with loyal eyes. "But I'm not sure if I'm good enough for all this." As the cold wind blew through the trees in the backyard, Tommy felt a mix of gratitude and fear. He knew he had a lot to learn, and that the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. But as he remembered the promise he had made to himself and to Harris, he stood up, determined to keep going. Deep down, something inside him knew that despite all the difficulties, he was no longer alone. And that, somehow, was what gave him the strength to move forward. The days passed slowly for Tommy, each bringing new challenges but also small victories. He was starting to adjust to the rhythm of school, though he still felt like an outsider in that world of luxury and privilege. Every class, every test, was a battle against the feeling that he didn't belong there. Still, he kept pushing forward. Harris had been clear. The opportunity was there, but it was Tommy's responsibility to make the most of it, and Tommy wanted to honor that trust. Over time, his determination began to pay off. He started to understand the subjects better, and with the help of private tutors, his confidence grew a little more each day. His relationship with Kate also developed. She was different from the other students. While many avoided him or looked at him with disdain, Kate treated him naturally, as if he were just another student, not the street kid everyone seemed to see. They started meeting often during breaks, talking about classes or simply sharing quiet moments in the school courtyard. "I told you they'd get used to it," she said one day, biting into an apple and glancing at the other students around them. "You're not the new kid anymore." Tommy shrugged, looking out over the busy courtyard. Although he was no longer the main target of curious stares, he still felt the distance between himself and the others. But being around Kate made things easier. She didn't seem to care about the difference between their worlds, and that comforted him. "I still feel out of place sometimes," he admitted, kicking a small pebble on the ground. Kate looked at him with a sympathetic smile. "You know, nobody here really knows anyone's story. They may act like they have it all together, but everyone has their insecurities." She paused for a second, thinking. "You're lucky, Tommy. You have a story worth telling. And more importantly, you have the courage to be different." Kate's words echoed in Tommy's mind long after that conversation. Courage. He had never thought of himself that way. He always believed he was just doing what he needed to survive. But now, away from the streets, he was beginning to realize that maybe there was more to him than just being a kid trying to stay alive. At Harris's house, things were changing too. The billionaire, though distant in many ways, was starting to show a more personal interest in Tommy's life. There were no long talks or emotional moments, but small gestures that made it clear Harris was watching his progress and cared. One evening, while Tommy was studying in the living room, Harris came in and sat on the couch beside him. He was flipping through some papers, as he often did, but it seemed like he was paying more attention to Tommy than to the documents. "How are things at school?" Harris asked, without taking his eyes off the papers. Tommy, surprised by the question, looked up. Harris rarely asked about his school life, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. "It's going well," Tommy replied hesitantly. "I'm still getting used to it, but I think I'm improving." Harris nodded, still focused on his papers, but there was something in his posture that indicated he was listening closely. "You're doing a good job, Tommy," he finally said, lifting his eyes. "It's not easy adapting to a new life. I know that better than anyone." Tommy felt a warmth from those words he hadn't expected. Coming from Harris, a man who was always so reserved, it meant a lot. He had worked so hard not to disappoint him, and hearing that his effort was being recognized felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," Tommy said sincerely. "I just want to make it all worth it." Harris watched him for a moment, and Tommy noticed a slight softness in his eyes that he hadn't seen before. Keep it up. What you do with the opportunities you're given is what defines who you are. Harris stood up, leaving his papers behind. And I believe you'll go far. As Harris left the room, Tommy stood still for a moment, absorbing what he had just heard. Those words carried weight, an expectation he knew he couldn't ignore. But at the same time, there was encouragement there, a strength he felt growing inside him. In the weeks that followed, Tommy dedicated himself even more to his studies. He wasn't the brightest student in the class, but his determination caught the attention of the teachers. Slowly, he started to stand out, and the label of street kid was being replaced with a new one, the kid who never gave up. But even though he was making progress, the feeling of not fully belonging was still there. The memories of his life on the streets haunted him, especially on colder nights when he remembered what it was like to fight for every meal. Now, with a warm bed and a roof over his head, he felt grateful, but also guilty. One afternoon, after a particularly tough class, he found Kate in the courtyard, and they sat together as they often did. She noticed his silence and asked, "What's bothering you?" Tommy looked down at the ground, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve to be here. There are so many people out there still on the streets hungry while I'm here with everything I ever dreamed of." Kate studied him carefully before responding. "You've earned this, Tommy. You had the courage to be honest, to keep going when everything was against you. That already makes you someone who deserves to be here." "But what about the others?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "What about the ones still out there?" Kate put her hand on his shoulder, her expression serious. "Maybe that's your path. Maybe in the future, you'll be able to help those people. You've already done more than most would in your situation. You just can't carry the weight of the whole world on your shoulders." Tommy smiled, grateful for his friend's words. She was right. He still had a lot to learn, but he also had a lot to give. And maybe this was just the beginning of something bigger. The months flew by, and the Opportunity Center was thriving. What began as a small refuge for a few street kids had grown into a project far bigger than Tommy ever imagined. With Harris's help, new sponsors, and the dedication of the team, the center now served dozens of children, offering not just shelter but education, psychological support, and above all, hope. But as much as the center was growing, Tommy knew that his greatest triumph wasn't the size of the project, but the lives he was helping to transform. The proof was in the children who, little by little, began to open up and believe that they could have a different future. On a quiet morning, Tommy walked through the center, observing the kids participating in various activities. He felt at peace, knowing that despite the challenges, they were on the right path. In the distance, he saw Sam, a boy who had arrived shy and scared, now laughing with other kids while playing basketball. Sam's transformation was one of the many victories that kept Tommy motivated. But despite all the progress, there was still one issue that weighed on him: Jordan. The 14-year-old boy who had run away months ago remained one of the center's biggest challenges. Even after returning, Jordan stayed distant, always on the outskirts of activities, never fully trusting the process. That afternoon, as Tommy walked through the courtyard, he found Jordan sitting alone on a bench. The sight brought back memories of his own loneliness before Harris found him. Tommy knew he couldn't force Jordan to trust, but he also knew he would never stop trying. "Mind if I sit?" Tommy asked, approaching. Jordan shrugged but didn't push him away. Tommy sat beside him in silence for a few minutes, watching the kids play in the distance. "You know you don't have to do this alone, right?" Tommy said, breaking the silence. Jordan glanced at him but stayed quiet. After a while, he finally spoke, his voice low and full of frustration. "I don't know how to trust people. Every time I've tried, someone let me down." Tommy sighed, understanding exactly how Jordan felt. He had once shared that same distrust of the world. "I get it," Tommy said calmly. "Before Harris found me, I thought the same way. I figured no one cared, that no one would ever do anything for me, but he showed me that sometimes it's worth taking the risk. Yes, some people will let us down, but others can change our lives forever." Jordan stayed silent for a long time. Tommy didn't expect an immediate response. He knew Jordan needed time just as he had once needed time. When Tommy stood up to leave, Jordan finally spoke, not looking directly at him. "Maybe I'm not ready yet, but I'm trying." That was all Tommy needed to hear. A small step, but a step in the right direction. As Tommy continued to balance the responsibilities of the center's growth with his personal connection to the children, he reflected on how far he had come. Harris, always a figure of support, had taught him the value of being both a leader and a human. Kate, with her unwavering friendship, had been by his side through it all, reminding him that he didn't have to carry the burden alone. One night, as Tommy reviewed activity reports and planned the center's next expansions, Harris entered the office, as he often did when there was something important to discuss. He sat across from Tommy, his expression serious but satisfied. "You've done an incredible job, Tommy," Harris began, looking at the young man. "This center is living proof that honesty and perseverance can change the course of lives." Tommy smiled, feeling the warmth of Harris's words. "I had a lot of help," Tommy responded humbly. "Without you and the team, none of this would have been possible." Harris shook his head, as if to disagree. "That may be true, but you're the heart of this place. Your story, your drive to do good is what inspires all of us to keep going." Tommy looked at Harris, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. He had reached a point he never imagined, and now he saw how much his life and the lives around him had changed because of one simple decision: to be honest. "I always wanted this center to be more than just a shelter," Tommy said, looking out the window. "I wanted it to be a place where kids felt seen, heard, and believed that their future could be different. And you've achieved that," Harris said with a nod of approval. "This center will be a legacy, a place where the cycle of poverty and distrust can be broken. And it all started with your decision to return that briefcase. Never underestimate the power of one choice." Harris's words echoed in Tommy's heart. The journey that had begun on the streets had turned into something much bigger than he ever imagined. He hadn't just found a path for himself, but had opened doors for so many other children who, like him, needed a chance. Years passed, and the Opportunity Center became one of the city's most respected institutions, helping hundreds of children get off the streets and find a future. Tommy, now more mature and confident, had solidified his position as a leader, but he never forgot his roots. He continued to be present for the children, remembering how important it was to give them support and believe in them. One day, as he watched a new group of children entering the center for the first time, Tommy felt a wave of emotion. He knew that not all of them would trust right away, that some carried wounds and doubts that would take time to heal. But he also knew that, like Jordan, Sam, and so many others, these children had a real chance at change. Beside him, Harris and Kate stood, proud of what they had built together. The center was more than an institution. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that one choice, no matter how small, could create a lasting impact. Tommy looked at his friends and the children, and with a smile on his face, he knew that his journey was far from over. He had created something that would continue to change lives even long after he had moved on. The legacy of honesty and compassion was written into the walls of the Opportunity Center, and this was only the beginning.